In addition to the two fronts of war where the fighting was taking place, Europe and the Pacific, there was also the home front to consider.
The United States had mobilized its armed forces with selective service registration, expanding the age group to ages 18 to 65 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Over 250,000 women would also join in and enlist as part of the Women's Army Corps, the Women Appointed for Volunteer Emergency Service, or WAVES, that was part of the Navy, and the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. By war's end, more than 16 million men and women had served in the armed forces. The United States also focused on economic mobilization. The War Production Board was established in 1942 to regulate the use of raw materials. Half of all factory production went into creating materials specifically for war, which by 1943, the United States was producing twice as many goods as all of the enemy countries combined. The Office of Price Administration froze prices and rents at March 1942 levels in order to help control the cost of living and prevent inflation. The United States increased taxes to finance the war, with many who would never have had to pay taxes before now being required to contribute. In 1939, only 4 million Americans had been required to file a tax return, but by 1945, that number was up to 50 million. The United States was able to pay for approximately 40% of the war cost during the war, and about 60% of it was borrowed in some form. To deal with potential shortage of supplies, the United States began rationing goods that could be used in support of key industries. With more people working, more money was available, but less consumer goods were available due to rationing and restrictions on what could be manufactured. This did have the potential to lead to inflation and shortages. The nation's assembly line demanded more and more workers to handle the increased amount of factory production. In addition, farmers were encouraged to plant more crops in order to feed both those here at home as well as the Allies abroad. The Office of Economic Stabilization oversaw the U.S. economy in an effort to control inflation, which was successful. During World War I, the cost of living had risen 170%, but during World War II, the cost of living increase was held to less than 29%. Some of the rationing and cost controls, though, would be retained, at least for a time, after the war had ended. More than 5 million women joined the labor force during the war, often moving to new communities to find jobs in the aircraft, munitions, and automobile industries. Propaganda campaigns urged women to fill the ranks on the nation's assembly lines, and increased wages could help swell family income, which would pave the way for post-war consumer demand. Rosie the Riveter became the symbolic image of women in the industrial workforce. For African Americans, the issue of civil rights rose during the war years. Massive migration of minorities began to occur towards the industrial centers, but violence plagued many cities, with the worst example occurring in Detroit in June of 1943, when a race riot left 25 African Americans dead, along with 9 whites. In some cases, Black Americans were excluded from well-paying jobs in war-related industries. But the Fair Employment Practices Committee helped to bring about an end to segregation amongst defense contractors. In addition, thousands of African Americans served with honor in the military forces. All units were still segregated in World War II, a situation that did not change until 1948, but did change because of the actions of men during the war. Japanese Americans faced some of the worst discrimination. Executive Order 9066, issued in February of 1942, ordered those of Japanese descent to leave what was labeled an exclusion zone all along the West Coast. More than 110,000 people would be forcibly removed from their homes and relocated to internment camps because the public was paranoid that those of Japanese ancestry, especially those in California, might lend aid to Japan. In most cases, they were given just 48 hours to dispose of all of their belongings, including any land or businesses that they owned. The camps themselves were in desolate areas across 7 states. Despite the harsh conditions, though, many Japanese Americans remained loyal to the U.S., and after 1943, more than 17,000 fought for the U.S. Army. Native Americans also saw significant gains during the war, as the U.S. government authorized the use of native languages, starting with an idea proposed by Navajo soldiers to use the unwritten and little-known language as a radio code in the Pacific. It ended decades of U.S. government attempts to eliminate Native American culture and language. These Navajo code talkers were highly prized amongst their unit, and their code was never broken by Japanese codebreakers and could be adjusted over the course of fighting, often switching between a couple of different codes that were in use. Now, 1944, late in the war, when it was obvious that the Allies were winning, also happened to be an election year for U.S. President. Franklin Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented 4th term, this time, though, with a new vice president, Harry Truman, as they were concerned over FDR's ill health. Republicans nominated Thomas Dewey, emphasizing a need for a change. But despite that increasingly frail health, FDR won overwhelmingly once again. At a final conference of the war for FDR at Yalta, the Big Three met to plan what they saw as the post-war world. Animosity between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was starting to be seen, as each had different ideas about the post-war political and economic position of Germany. They did promise to establish a United Nations, to be held at another conference, a conference that FDR did not live to see, as he died of a cerebral hemorrhage in April of 1945, just about 2 weeks before Hitler's suicide. The cost of the war was tremendous, with the U.S. having spent an estimated $288 billion on all aspects of the war. That would be an amount equal to about $5 trillion in today's dollars. The human cost was also significant, with an estimated 60 million killed worldwide, although many experts feel that that number is actually low due to many deaths likely going unreported. The U.S. alone lost nearly 300,000 who were killed in action, nearly all of them military. The Soviet Union, though, suffered the worst overall casualties, with nearly half of the overall total, followed by China. War crimes committed by both sides also resulted in millions of civilians and some military deaths as well. The Holocaust conducted by Germany resulted in the extermination of an estimated 6 million Jews, as well as another 5 to 6 million ethnic Poles, Slavs, and other minorities, both religious and racial minorities, in an ethnic cleansing that was part of Nazi propaganda. In addition, the war resulted in a changing of national boundaries, as once again Germany was stripped of territory, a significant portion of which was taken by Poland. The Soviet Union also expanded by absorbing 3 of the Baltic states, and then heavily influencing supposedly independent nations of Eastern Europe. Japan, too, was stripped of her colonies, leading to the creation of Korea. The three main Allied powers, despite their growing animosity, or at least between the USA and USSR, did agree on the establishment of the United Nations to replace the obviously failed League of Nations. But the establishment of two competing international military alliances, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and the Warsaw Pact, threatened the post-war peace and led to a prolonged arms race known as the Cold War, which lasted until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. A final legacy of World War II was the economic instability that spread throughout the world, at least everywhere except America, where a major economic boom was beginning, along with a baby boom, increasing consumer demand and preventing a return of rising unemployment. The Great Depression was finally over.